Welcome to the Professional Dog Trainers Australia podcast, Dog Training Matters. Dive into effective training and behaviour modification techniques, share expert insights, debate hot topics, and discuss how to build strong, positive relationships with our canine companions. Whether you're a seasoned trainer or just starting out, join us as we champion methods that respect both dogs and their human partners. Let's embark on this journey together to elevate the world of dog training, because dog training matters.
G'day everyone, and welcome to another episode of Dog Training Matters podcast. I'm your host, Trish Kavara, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Steve Courtney, who's the PDTA president, and Jackie Sakar, as well as Boyd Hooper, who are PDTA board members. Hello everyone.
Hi.
Hi, Trish.
So the topic for this podcast is a very big one, which is why this will be the first in a series of podcasts on this topic. We'll be discussing what is meant by training with a balanced perspective, or using a balanced approach to behaviour modification. There are various different models that have been put around, such as the LIMA principle. We also have Sue Friedman's The Hierarchy of Behaviour Change Procedures. That's a big one. The LIFE model, there is the force-free or purely positive approach, amongst others, all of which we will discuss. We'll also be investigating the pros and cons of each of these, including the misinformation and a lack of understanding around a lot of dog training protocols and procedures. As we know, dog training and behaviour modification is not a one-size-fits-all endeavour, which is why we will explain why different protocols are required in different situations and contexts. We all know that. Today, with social media, people are conditioned to learn via short clips. They want quick information or happy with, quick quotes and memes instead of proper long-term learning and research. When this happens, the nuance is missed. And to quote physicist Lawrence Krauss, often when you leave out nuance, you miss out on what's most important. So let's deep dive into what it means to train dogs and modify their behaviour using a balanced approach. So Steve, not long ago we were having a discussion at one of our meetings, and you were mentioning the conversation that you were having with someone with regards to balanced training, and you made a very interesting point as to what that person actually told you what they thought balanced training was. And just as a side note, I think the person wasn't a trainer, but it was just interesting conversation. Can you just fill us in on that conversation and what the person thought balanced training was?
Yeah, of course. It's an interesting point to start with. And I would probably say, first of all, to preface any of this, that I've never really referred myself to as a balanced trainer, but rather a dog trainer who is results focused. So in the social media world, the idea is that it almost someone requires a label or a descriptive term. And when we talk about that, in this particular situation, I saw someone being told warning against balanced training and the examples of what balanced is that you want to avoid. So they'd been this person is generally coming, she was just a pet owner with basic knowledge, not a dog trainer and that sort of stuff, loves her dogs and so on. And the information she got was generally not coming from a person that's balanced or a balanced trainer and supports balanced training, but a person who has a very little understanding of balanced training. So the examples that she'd given was, if balanced training is so good, would you like balanced health, where you are sick in balance to healthy? And so the word balance doesn't mean equal. It can mean correct proportions. So when a chef is cooking a dish, and that dish needs balancing, that certainly doesn't mean equal amounts of every component. To get a scale in balance with a rock on one side, you might need 50 pieces of paper to balance the scale. I also saw a meme or an infographic, and remembering that we're being taught to learn in a very flash of information, this infographic pasted the 4 quadrants on a page and gave the worst case scenario for all the quadrants bar positive reinforcement. So this is about talking about leading the witness. It's about trying to create an image, a negative image, I guess, of something that they don't approve of, rather than trying to provide information for people to learn from.
Yeah, just adding to that, just to put some concrete on it, I think that people often make the mistake of thinking that it means balance sort of in the literal sense, like for every potential appetitive incentive, you're entitled to use one aversive incentive, or for every reward, every food treat you give, you're entitled to give one leash correction. And we certainly don't mean that in any way. And nobody's ever even implied that. And again, that's people just taking the worst possible, they're straw manning the argument, they're taking the worst possible interpretation, and it's not a good faith argument at all. It is not a good faith argument. These people know fully well that that most balanced trainers are reward-based. We'll get into the details more, but really we're meaning exactly following the LIMA principle, which we'll get into as we go, where we use as inducive procedures or appetitive incentives, rewards, whenever possible and realistic, which means most of the time, and in some applications all of the time. There's certainly plenty of applications of dog training where we're not using any applied aversive incentives or anything that could be considered to be significantly intrusive on the dog, because we just don't need to. It's only just having that tool there that we use when and if we need it, as a, using the term fairly loosely, as a worst case scenario, okay? Now, some people's definition of worst case scenario is going to be different to others, and that's sort of going down a rabbit hole that we want to avoid. But certainly, most balanced trainers are reward-based. The vast majority of what they do incorporates inducive incentives, rewards, and just positive, using that in the hedonic sense, motivational techniques, and only employing any aversive or intrusive procedures, because we're dog lovers. Why would we want to use any more pressure or discomfort or anything like that than we need to? We absolutely don't. We're realistic enough to know that in a perfect world, everything could be done with rewards, like it would be for humans, okay? All we need to do is reward our kids. There's never any sanctions, never any punishments, they never get into any trouble. We don't have to, do anything negative in the hedonic context. But we all know that in the real world, that's just not how it works. So we try to be as positive, using it in the hedonic context, as nice and friendly and appetitive as we can be. But we also know that we've got to be realistic. Trish?
So, yeah, no, that's I actually like Steve's comment about, the chef balancing the food. I think that makes perfect sense, and I think using that analogy is great, because I think it puts it into the perspective of most people's minds when we're talking about the balanced approach, and I think that's great. But I just want to define intrusive and aversive, because we are going to be talking about the LIMA principle along the way. So when we're talking about intrusive, and I think we need to remember that we are talking about interfering or imposing on the dog's natural world, so what the dog does, what the dog enjoys, and it often employs relatively extreme measurements. So you have to remove the dog's freedom, you're depriving the dog of food, you're depriving the dog of the ability to explore, and I think that's pretty, I don't know about you, but I think that's pretty severe in a lot of situations. As some people will say, in order for your dog not to react, don't take it out, don't go for walks. In order for your dog to want to take the reward from you, deprive it of food so that you can use food rewards. There's a really good pro trainer and behaviour consultant called Jackie Abacare, and she wrote a piece. I'm just going to read off a sheet of paper at the moment. It says, a behavioural rehabilitation and training plan that relies heavily on long-term management and differential reinforcement without including the deliberate use of aversive is flawed and ineffective, plain and simple. Controlling and managing the environment of the dog often becomes a lifelong strategy. Dogs are permanently kept on leash, they're prevented from getting into the vicinity of their triggers, and they are thus often prevented from being given the freedom to fulfill their physical and behavioural needs. This is no way to live a happy life for a dog or their owner. Being the troll under the bridge is just as emotionally exhaustive as it is frustrating for the traveller trying to cross. I really, really like that paragraph. And then we talk about aversive. Aversive is something unpleasant, obviously, something undesirable, something the dog doesn't want. And aversive incentives incorporate 3 of the 4 operant quadrants. So negative reinforcement, negative punishment, and positive punishment. So that's my take on part of the LIMA. I suppose part of when we're talking about intrusive and aversive, that's my understanding of it.
Thanks, Trish. So clarifying, as you mentioned at the beginning of that, you said that we're going to be talking about the LIMA. So let's just clarify what the real LIMA is. Both, all of us really have opinions on this, and Jackie and I particularly. So we're going to be nailing that point home, because all of us, we've had discussions prior to starting this podcast in the lead up weeks, and we all largely agree that if we had to summarise the balanced approach in a snapshot, it would be heavily orientated to the LIMA principle, as you rightly pointed out, Trish. I'm not necessarily saying that the LIMA principle and balanced are one and the same thing, but they are very highly correlated. Personally, in my opinion, I think they're extremely closely correlated, and that the LIMA principle, properly interpreted, is really the essence of what balanced training means. So as a bit of a quick comparative analysis, and everybody's going to be helping me here, but particularly Jackie, as a comparative analysis between LIMA principle and other protocols and the interpretations of it, a lot of the other things that have come up, the behavioural hierarchy and those kind of things, life procedures and the like, are often attempts at reinventing the wheel, but they're less coherent and less generalisable. They just, when you investigate them in detail and you try and apply them in real world settings, you start to realise their limitations quite badly. And you can fall back on LIMA and it seems to fit everywhere. It's just such a universal, generalisable, functional protocol when properly utilised and interpreted, that is. Now, sometimes these people have the best of intentions, like Susan Friedman's hierarchy of behavioural interventions and stuff. Absolutely, I've got a lot of respect for Susan, very knowledgeable and very good quality person. And she's done that hierarchy up, which we're going to talk about a little bit as we go. But it just runs into problems when you use it. It's not her fault. It's just the essence of the hierarchy just has its own limitations. On the surface, at a first glance, it seems to make sense. But the further you get into it, you go, well, hang on, what about this and what about that? And then it doesn't fit here and you have to squeeze it there. And in fact, it's quite surprising when you get into the weeds how difficult it is to apply those kind of things in the real world, any sort of flowcharts or spreadsheets or hierarchy models, whereas LIMA pretty much solves all of those problems, okay? And then, of course, sometimes they're highly ideologically motivated. People have agendas and ideologies that where they're adamant about force-free or positive only, a topic that we're not going to be going into in part 1 of this, okay? So, but we certainly in part 2 and or 3, we'll be addressing that in more detail, a sort of a comparative analysis and the force-free versus a balanced model, so to speak.
If I can throw something in there, Boyd, like in my personal observation of people looking at LIMA across a broad spectrum of trainers, practitioners, those sorts of things, there seems to be a really, really strong concern about the MA, the minimal aversives, right? And a lot of that, I don't want to use anything that the dog won't like, and really no focus at all on the least intrusive. So the dog is, locked up, doesn't move around, as you said, can't experience any normal life, realistically, off-leash, enrichment, any of those sort of things. And it doesn't seem to be that much of a concern, whereas people are highly focused on the minimal aversive problem.
I don't necessarily think that it's not a concern. I just think that they don't think about it. When you introduce it and you explain it, like Trish did a few minutes ago when she gave her definition of intrusive and read Jackie Abakar's quote out, then they go, yeah, I get it. But, it's not kind of the first thing that comes to mind, is it? Let's be honest. Jackie, did you add that?
Sorry, can I just give you a real world example is, a client that came to me, the German Shepherd, started showing signs of aggression towards other dogs. The vet medicated the dog, and following the medication, the dog became aggressive towards owners and relatives that had never been before. They were instructed to take the dog home, build a habitat where the dog could live and never leave or euthanize it. No one was concerned about, we didn't want to be able to say to the dog, hey, you're not allowed to do that, but we're okay to put it in basically a prison for the rest of its life.
I think that's important to really sort of hone in. I think this might be a thing for episode 2, but, we talk about, what is worse, intrusion or aversion? What's worse? That's my question. And typically I wouldn't want someone to say, well, you've got to stay at home and you can't leave the four walls like we did over lockdown. Like, that was an intrusion of our freedoms.
And that was aversive.
It was horrible and caused so many issues. But I digress. But yeah, I think that's, looking at it further, what is worse? And people seem to, as Steve said, concentrate on the aversive side of things because that seems to be the worst in people's minds. That seems to be the worst thing.
We are going to cover that a little bit even in this episode towards the end when we just touch on the 5 freedoms, because one of the 5 freedoms relates directly to that, not giving the dog, or giving the animal, because the 5 freedoms is more about animals broadly. In fact, doesn't really correlate to dogs all that well. But yeah, we'll certainly be getting into that, guys, as we go along for sure. And we all totally do that. But Steve's point is valid, is that we have to think about both. Okay, so just finishing off my point there. So, sometimes there's an ideological motivation, and other times it's a marketing ploy where people are just saying, oh, I'm force-free, humane, but they don't. I used to sell prong collars to somebody that promoted themselves as, a positive-only sort of trainer, but they were buying prong collars off me and using them when they needed to, So in other words, they had the usual protocol. Karen Pryor, who's known for this, got found out that she's using electronics, e-collars and things like that, and that in fact her dogs were out of control, so she really couldn't take them places and do things because their training was so poor, because she didn't want to use any aversives. But when she was at home, she was using an invisible enclosure and other electronics to manage her dogs at home. So what they say and what they do is often two different things, but we'll get into that later on. I want to read 2 quotes to you guys just so we're clear on the LIMA principle. Jackie's going to expand on this shortly. But so the first one from Lindsay in 2001, that's volume 2. Both excessively intrusive and aversive techniques may adversely affect the owner compliance or violate humane standards of practice. Trainers should make an effort to conform their training interventions to the least intrusive and minimally aversive principle. So any time that anybody says that Lindsay's just trying to advocate for the use of aversive or intrusive protocols, he clearly explains that and warns that that using intrusive or aversive techniques can have side effects, and we need to be really conscientious, and we need to use them only when necessary for that reason. And just to point out, and we'll get into this in later episodes, just because something can cause problems doesn't mean that it will if it's misused. I mean, a car can cause a lot of damage if somebody decides to drive down the road and just start running over people like some psychopaths do every now and again. They, kill 20 people. We all know that a car or a truck in the wrong hands or used inappropriately is an incredibly dangerous thing. But look, so too is a fork that you eat your dinner with. If you really wanted to do a lot of damage to people with a fork, gee, you could do a lot of harm to people, couldn't you? All right, if you set yourself up and said, my intent is to do a lot of harm with a fork. So that's the first thing.
While people will acknowledge you saying all those things, Boyd, and go, yes, I agree, I'll go, look, we understand that anything can be misused, I suppose. But there's a moment in time when a person who's an educator providing information, they might prioritise themselves over the information. The benefits then become lost, right? So I really want people to like my ideology or me or buy my product. So facts start to get delayed in the way of the things I'm going to tell you, the positives about my product and the negatives about others. And there's possible side effects or downsides to balanced training. There are possible side effects and downsides to force-free training. There's even side effects and downsides to training a dog, but being clear and transparent about these, educate the learner fully so they may better avoid the side effects and the downsides and create, strengthen the behaviours and positive outcomes for the dogs. And LIMA is really all about that.
Yeah, again, there's a lot to be said in the nuance of what you just said. There's downsides to everything for sure, right? The side effects of every drug, even the best drugs, potentially have side effects, and we agree with that, okay? But what I will say is that there are some drugs, for example, let's take aspirin or, or even caffeine, if you want to call that a drug or whatever. Now, used in an appropriate manner, like 99% of people do, although those things can have side effects, they're incredibly rare when used appropriately. And the times when we see things, it's almost always when they're misused or abused, okay? But they serve an overall benefit to people, and as a result, we accept them, just like we would with a car and certain drugs and stuff. So it's a risk assessment there, okay? What I would say, and we're going to deal with this in more, but the difference between a balanced perspective and a sort of force-free, purely positive perspective is that in most cases, if you adopt a purely positive perspective, you must use intrusive things, which is what Trish talked about, okay? Management, keeping the dog on lead, not going to places where there's going to be triggers, not letting the dog run free, not giving the dog the freedom and being able to take the dog places. So there is an intrinsic problem with that model, okay, that it causes that dynamic. But to your point from before, Steve, the problem is that people don't think about that part of it. They think in the immediate, okay, right now I give the dog a leash correction. Maybe that leash correction means that he stops being aggressive to other dogs, and now I can take him out for plenty of walks and go down the off-lead dog park, and he has a happy life because I gave him that correction. Had I not given him that correction, I couldn't take him out. Okay, I couldn't go for walks because I never knew what was going to be along the way, and there was dogs behind fences along the way, and I couldn't go down to the off-lead park, and I couldn't take him camping, and I couldn't give him the quality of life. And I think that's what Jackie Abakar's point is, it's what Trish's point is, and you emphasise the point. Let me just read something from the International Association of Animal Behaviour Consultants, guys. The International Association of Animal Behaviour Consultants supports a least intrusive, minimally aversive, LIMA, approach to behaviour modification and training. LIMA does not justify the use of punishment in lieu of other effective interventions and strategies. In the vast majority of cases, desired behaviour change can be effected by focusing on the animal's environment, physical well-being, and operant and classical interventions such as differential reinforcement of an alternative behaviour, desensitisation, and counter-conditioning. No argument there. That is balanced, okay? And so therefore, you know, that's, I think that as long as we're all clear on what we mean, Jackie's going to expand a little bit more on it shortly, but when we say LIMA, we're talking about reward-based, only incorporating intrusive or aversive protocols if we need them, and then in the minimum sense that we can, the least intrusive, minimally aversive protocol, which not only means the intensity, but also the duration and the context, okay? It's just acknowledging the reality that we're not going to be able to get really good behaviour that allows us to give our dogs a great life and go places and do really cool stuff with our dogs by just having a food treat mentality as the only dynamic. Certainly, it's a great dynamic and it's a really big part of it. We're only arguing that it's just not enough with every dog in every circumstance to be able to get that level of safety and control in a dog so as then we can give the dog the better quality of life.
And I think too, what's really important is that if we stopped and just, we were talking about, you know, someone trying to give you information based on to make their side look better. If we wanted to learn about LIMA, it's really important, I think, to not describe that to people as a counter to other than LIMA, right? We just talk about LIMA as its own benefits and exploring all of its facets. Like we need, you know, sometimes we might need to manage certain things initially, but when we talked about intrusive versus aversive, we have to be in the scenario of intrusiveness can last days, weeks, months, years, or a whole lifetime. And although it might not be uncomfortable, it might be a mildly aversive situation. We might be talking about, would it be better for a momentary situation where the dog goes, "Oh, I didn't love that. Maybe I shouldn't do that." So maybe the duration is one of the determining factors of how I suppose uncomfortable this inverse situation where the dog says, "I have got no life other than this small space."
Two things I'd like to value add there quickly, Stephen, and I'll let you just jump back. The first one is that momentary stimulus is not only has an effect on behaviour because it's aversive. In other words, you said, oh, I don't like that, I don't want that to occur. That's true. But also, it's a really salient information signal, effectively saying, don't do that. Okay, that's the wrong choice in this situation. And sometimes a dog just doesn't realise that that's the wrong choice. But if all you're doing is a differential reinforcement, you're rewarding the dog for an alternative, you've never really communicated that the other behaviour was wrong and you shouldn't do it or there'll be consequences. All you've done is said, this is better, you can earn more rewards. But when the context changes or in momentary lapse of reasons, because there was never any communication that you are not allowed to do that, that's the wrong choice, okay, in that circumstance, then those procedures are going to break down. And that's talked about extensively. So, yeah, I think that's important.
Can I go into a little bit about the Humane hierarchy and kind of how it's moved on from Lindsay and some of the things that I think have been lost, which have then led more into the life model?
Well, Trish, did you want to say something about the hierarchy first and then we'll move on to life?
I think it's probably an idea for Jackie to speak about this because she knows it a little bit more than I do. But obviously we have a graph in front of us from Sue Friedman's Humane hierarchy of behaviour, where she has a bit of a scale, and I will put this up in the members page. So for anyone that's interested, you could have a look at this image, and it shows a car, and it starts off with, looking at the nutrition and the physical setting. We're then looking at the antecedent arrangements, and then it moves up the scale to positive reinforcement, differential reinforcement or of alternative behaviour, so your DRIs or DRAs, and then extinction, etc., etc. So this model, I believe, differs somewhat, or is taken from Steve Lindsay, but it differs somewhat. Do you want to explain it a little bit more there, Jackie?
Yeah, Jackie, just sorry, can I just, because then we can move,
go ahead.
Run it through. I just want to say that in Friedman's hierarchy, as Trish just said, the second one is the antecedent arrangements, okay, which is the sort of management protocols. What sort of triggers is the dog exposed to? What sort of environments and situations? In other words, she is suggesting that managing the environment of the dog so you don't have problems in the first place is a really high up on the hierarchy of things that you should do. You should do, okay? Whereas she's saying that negative reinforcement and negative punishment, like timeouts and response costs, are right up at the opposite end. They're things you should do as rarely as possible and only if you absolutely need them. Now, therefore, this is way skewed, to Steve's point earlier, towards concern with aversive stimuli rather than intrusive. Because if you're high priority is on managing the antecedent arrangements, that is where you go, what you do, whether the dog is on lead, what other triggers and distractors and competing motivations and stimuli are going to be around. So for me personally, I don't put much emphasis on the antecedent arrangements because my dogs are really well trained. They're not aggressive to other dogs. They're not aggressive to people. They don't chase animals. They don't create problems. And so I don't have to think. I can go places. Everybody knows I take my dogs everywhere, right? And they're off lead 99% of the time. If I want to, I can just walk through a shopping centre. I can go down a local park. I can walk through anywhere, just go anywhere. And other people's dogs are around and everything. And my dogs just don't care. So I don't have to prioritise antecedent arrangements, which means I can go places, do things. My dogs have a great life. They're off lead most of the time and they're going places and doing things. And I don't have to leave them at home and always keep them on lead and everything like that. So while I respect the hierarchy and I see the point, like I said at the beginning as part of the sort of introduction, once you dig into it, you start to realise, well, hang on a minute, that's not it. And then tying back to what Steve said a minute ago, one or two aversive experiences, well-timed, well set up, well structured, can change a dog's perspective and therefore make it understand it's not that this behaviour is inappropriate, let's say being reactive towards another dog, for example. And now that gives the dog so many more freedoms and so much more quality of life, which goes back to what Trish said, what Jackie Abakar said, what we're all saying here. Okay, so I just want to say that it on the surface, if you don't dig in, it looks great. But as soon as you start really assessing it and putting it into applied examples, you go, okay, oh no, it doesn't really, oh no, I've got a problem with that. And as I said, it's way balanced towards aversive things, not intrusive. Now, I will say that there's a nice talk with Susan Friedman with Ken Ramirez at the Ranch is what they call their thing. Okay, it's like a podcast thing, just from a couple of years ago. I can't remember how long ago. It's not that long. So Susan Friedman, Ken Ramirez at the Ranch. You can find it on YouTube, and you hear them having a pretty reasonable sort of discussion. They're both sort of on the force-free, sort of positive-only spectrum sort of thing. You would say they're on that side of the argument, but they're not absolutists, and they totally acknowledge the reality of the situation. And Susan, on multiple occasions, has acknowledged the limitations of her hierarchy. She doesn't try and say it's the perfect answer, that it solves all puzzles. She's well aware. It's just designed as a bit of a representation, as a very broad guideline. So, she's a pretty balanced person in the overall scheme of things. She certainly, I would definitely not call her ideologically captured or anything like that.
Before you jump in, Jackie, something I'd say with when we're looking at, a dog going through life as a puppy, it may come into contact with, something hot, cold, sharp, hard, and learn, I should be a little careful around that. I shouldn't run in there. Creates that little bit of an inhibition at diving into that behaviour without some caution. Now, when we get a dog and we raise this in domestication, it may not learn these things. If you let it play ultimately with other dogs all the time, eventually seeing a strange dog, instead of switching on a bit of, I might go over there cautiously and assess the dog's body language and see if we can then, have some sort of greeting, the dog might tear over to another dog, and he can only be optimistic about play. And this might trigger defensiveness in the other dog, and then there's a fight ensues. So at the end of the day is that they may not have learned the natural cautions because their socialisation may have been skewed or limited, and they don't understand where danger may occur. And sometimes the idea of adding an aversive is to go and say, caution, probably shouldn't, rush into that situation without consideration.
Sort of teaching life lessons, isn't it?
Yes, 100%.
Yeah. Just like it was for us, you learn not to jump off things that are too high and do stupid things because they are going to cause harm or they're dangerous, and it's only through the experience of those things, especially in dogs, because at least with humans, we can tell our kids, don't pick up the snake, don't pick up the spider, be careful picking up that bit of tin out the back because there could be a snake around there, and 1,000 other things we tell our kids, don't step out in front of the moving vehicle. Okay, etc. Don't jump out the window when we're driving, okay? And like thousands and thousands of things that we, when kids are too young, we strap them in and secure them and compensate. And that's what we have to be doing for our dogs. If we're not going to be prepared to educate them and just to do differential reinforcement, firstly, it's not that feasible in so many circumstances. It's good in theory, and secondly, it still doesn't teach them not to do the other thing. It may teach them that there's an opportunity for a reward if you do B instead of A, which is good, and it's beneficial. But unless you learn, don't do A, do not do A, do not attack the snake, for example, okay? Do not run out in front of the car, okay?
Can I just jump in? Sorry, because it's all good stuff. I just think before we move on, I just wanted to cover a little bit about the advancement of the hierarchy before we go on to the next point.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to say, which kind of feeds into everything that all of you have been saying, is since Dr. Friedman moved into the Humane hierarchy or developing that, it obviously has a lot of benefits, that it's trying to reduce significantly the overuse of aversives and heavy-handedness, etc. What it's done, though, is it's kind of created this linear pathway in decision-making and dog training. And because that's been put into a lot of certifications internationally and a lot of dog organisations, what I believe is starting to happen is the Humane hierarchy was what really started the ideology from starting to get bigger and bigger. And as you said, Boyd, like Susan Friedman, Ken Ramirez, the late Dr. Sophia Yin, etc., they weren't like force-free. They were kind of like the Humane hierarchy. We should be minimising aversives. But I think what's been lost is Lindsay's emphasis on competence of the trainer if they are to use aversives. That's kind of been thrown out a little bit. And that relationship, that least intrusive, what impacts the relationship between the dog and the owner. And as you said, Boyd, antecedent arrangement is so highly prioritised, it's above positive reinforcement. You've got negative reinforcement extinction so far back and positive punishment as a do not use. And none of this has been scientifically validated, that if we follow this framework, if dogs are better off this way. And I think we would agree that there are times when aversives should be used first. So I think what the humane hierarchy accidentally has created is a push towards this more extremist ideology, because the hierarchy is more focused on than the actual dogs and the nuance in dog training. And the life model from Dr. Eduardo Fernandez, which came out a couple of years ago, has taken that to another degree, saying that even Susan Friedman's LIMA is too aversive and that there should be a blanket, you do not use aversives. He doesn't say that you shouldn't use negative reinforcement, but there's this now no tools, no positive punishment whatsoever, because it comes back to the worst type of aversive must be fear and pain in quotation marks, whereas that's not necessarily the worst type of aversive at all.
Yeah, can you give us a bit more information on the life side of things?
So what basically the premise of life is, there's a big emphasis on Steve Lindsay's LIMA in life. And the unfortunate part of it is I don't think Dr. Fernandez understands exactly how balanced trainers utilise positive reinforcement and aversives, and still
Let's just clarify, Dr. Fernandez is not a dog trainer in any way.
No, Dr. Eduardo Fernandez is a welfare scientist. He works quite closely with a lot of like the Pet Professional Guild, etc. So he's very along the lines of the ideology and force free. I've spoken to him in person on the phone, and I would say he definitely doesn't really understand what balanced training is doing. So he's really tried to say that Lindsay, Steve Lindsay in his books, was just trying to find reasons to use aversives, and has actually misquoted him in the life model. And the life model is basically saying that no aversive should be used anymore, that LIMA is even too aversive in any form, and uses a lot of citations and statements from science, from history and in dog training, which haven't really been substantiated. So really it's a theoretical piece. I would argue there's no scientific validity to it.
Yeah. Well, just to add value to it, you said there that he's misrepresented LIMA, which you and I have discussed previously, and we both agree. So I'll just read something from Lindsay from 2005 from volume 3, because as you said, Fernandez in his paper says, I'll quote Fernandez first, Lindsay intended LIMA to be a framework to help dog trainers select their aversive stimuli and tools, which kind of implies that Lindsay was trying to leverage in which aversive tool to use as the sort of primary model of what LIMA is about. But let's hear what Lindsay actually said about it. Okay, this is now a quote from Lindsay. Aversive procedures should only be used to achieve cynopractic objectives not otherwise attainable by non-aversive means alone. Further, all training procedures that produce discomfort, startle or loss should be applied in adherence to the LIMA principle. So he's saying loss. So loss, taking the toy, taking the food away, time-out procedures. He's incorporating all of those into that dynamic, okay?
Can you just define what cynopraxics means to people that are listening who might not have heard that term before?
Yeah, it's probably beyond the scope to go into it in too much details, but maybe we'll go into that in part 2 because I've got some information around it. But basically it's just a protocol of looking at the evolutionary side of the animal, looking at what the animal is, what its needs are, you know, the species typical needs of the animal, how it interprets the world, how it, you know, its cognitive and emotional structures, and looking at the overall dynamic of the animal, and then adapting and incorporating the particular protocols and procedures and tools and everything that fit in that sort of dynamic in the most humane and effective way, you know, is the way that I would sort of
That's
describe
what I think has been lost in the later models. And I think that's your ethology and everything, which isn't spoken about as much as it should be. So I think that's so important that people understand that factor.
Yeah, it's taking, definitely exactly right. It's taking into account the ethological aspects of it, but only taking them into account. The cynopraxic model is designed to be considering all of the factors, okay, even society at large, and the dynamics of the relationship between the owner and the dog, etc. Looking at absolutely everything. It's pretty complicated. Like, that's from volume 3, that quote, and that's, for those that don't know that book, that is a massive book, right? Makes a brilliant doorstop on a windy day, and it's pretty sort of in depth.
I wish he would update them. I would love to see a revised edition of those 3 volumes. I think it'd be so good.
Jackie, was there anything else that you wanted to say about life models?
Yeah, just to touch on a little bit more about the life principle. One of the things I think is quite important that people understand isn't really accurate is Fernandez claims that research has shown that force-free training is just as, if not more effective than the use of any aversives. And he cites 3 studies in that which just absolutely do not show that whatsoever. And I won't go into the details of that, but he cites Cooper 2014 and China 2020, which is the e-collar study that compared positive reinforcement, which has so many flaws. But he's not mentioning that that's the same data and that he's really just cited 2 different studies that focused on different elements, but it's the same data. What that research showed was it was actually the biggest differences were between the different trainers, not necessarily the e-collar group and positive reinforcement, but the trainers that did e-collar and non-e-collar and the other trainers that just did positive reinforcement. So there's a lot to talk about there. I won't go into it. The other study he cites as positive reinforcement being just as effective is Vera de Castro 2021. And she very recently came out to reiterate that the research did not show that. It actually wasn't even an efficacy study. It was a welfare study. And looking at long-term welfare, the mixed group, which we would call balanced training, and the positive reinforcement group, or force-free, had no significant differences in welfare after the training. So it's completely misquoted. And the other little part of that, just to cover as well, is Fernandez also talks about the Brelands, who worked with Skinner and kind of took Skinner's principles to animal training. And he uses the Brelands, as they stated, you can train anything with positive reinforcement. The reality is, though, the Brelands, once they started doing a lot of animal training, discovered instinctive drift, or they might not have discovered it, but they covered it, when they noticed that you can train behaviours with positive reinforcement, in their case it was pigs, to do things like pick up coins and put them in a piggy bank. But over time, instinctive drift meant that the animal's natural behaviours and instinctive behaviours will come back because the pigs started rooting at the coins and grabbing them, which is what they would do in their natural life. So I think that's a really good point to make, that even the Brelands are saying positive reinforcement by itself might not be enough. Doesn't mean they said you have to use aversives, but they did show without other control elements, positive reinforcement trained behaviours can start to go into extinction because instinctive behaviour takes over. And we see that in the research, obviously, if we start looking at predation, etc., and training.
Jackie, can I say you and I and all of us really have looked at many studies, and often those studies will come back and they're trying to explain the problems with a prong collar, for example. And you open up the study, and before you read the whole thing, you can just search for the word prong, and it doesn't exist in the study. So at the end of the day is somebody will go, I'm going to put forth a link proving that prong collars are bad. And most people go, oh, they're bad because it's a study, without opening the study and actually coming to realise this study has got nothing to do with that tool whatsoever.
No.
So
the
this
irony
happens
is
so
the
frequently.
only experimental studies that have looked at prong collars found no issues with them. So that's the irony of it.
Which many practitioners who would use prong collars around the world have already discovered and said, no, there's no issue. We're going this way because this is going to be the LIMA principle for this particular dog in this circumstance.
The truth of the matter is that a lot of material out there isn't presented in the correct context. It's cherry-picked snippets taken from Lindsay's LIMA or other things, and, people are doing it with the wrong intentions. We talked about it at the beginning, okay? A balanced perspective is much more nuanced, and we all love dogs, and we would rather never having to use intrusive or aversive protocols, but we're just talking about what happens in the real world. Steve, did you have a comment I think you had something you want to value add on.
Yeah, we earlier on I meant to mention too is that we're finding, and I discussed this with you the other day, Boyd, is that people who've talked to me about making YouTubes that have content in there that are 2, 3, 5 minutes plus, and they're informational videos are not getting much engagement, whereas 30-second reels, TikToks, 10-second flashes of information are where it's at. So this is the way that people are being conditioned to learn information, and it turns them off investing time into learning things properly. These very short splashes of information are only there to present, the creator's opinion, as in they're the only points of consideration, not the nuances, not the devil is in the detail, yes, but, or this is good in that situation. So when we condition ourselves to learn through very, short, sharp, flashy images, we really can't learn all of the information that we need to make educated decisions on the information being presented to us.
Yeah. In fact, the misrepresentations of things, and particularly Lindsay's, is actually misrepresented in both directions. They cherry pick information, which you guys have already sort of all mentioned. But just to put some concrete on that, the cherry-picked information sometimes makes it look like he's advocating primarily aversive procedures. So the life model does that, okay? That misrepresents and cherry-picks to make it look like he's advocating and promoting the use of aversive procedures and trying to justify them, and that's what the LIMA principle is really about. Okay, an advocacy of the use of aversive and intrusive procedures. And that's not true, as we've pointed out with the references that we've provided and the quotes and the like. And if you read Lindsay, there's just no way that you could legitimately, with good intentions, interpret it that way. You'd have to be manipulating things and being, to be honest, virtually dishonest to interpret that way. And then, of course, some people cherry pick the information the other way and they make it look like LIMA advocates for a thoughts-free, positive-only way. And you read some of the organisations who say we follow the LIMA principle, which means you can't use any aversive protocols because that would be a breach of the LIMA principle, in which case both of them are not true, okay?
An important factor, Boyd, would be what motivates people to cherry pick information is to be able to sway the learner into their preferred explanations and way of doing things.
Which is a good lead in for the next episode.
Yeah.
I just wanted to briefly mention the 5 freedoms. I know we're going to be talking about in more detail in the next episode. So hint, hint, guys, we will be having another discussion on LIMA. This is primarily to do with livestock, not so much with dogs, and it doesn't actually translate over to dogs. Boyd, I think you were the one that mentioned behaviourist Bonnie Beaver has a really good review on the 5 freedoms.
Absolutely excellent.
Are you able to provide a link so I can put that up on our members page for them to have a look?
Yeah, absolutely.
For the folks at home who are listening to that, the 5 freedoms, what is it realistically? It's just an internationally recognised like a foundational framework. It's often used by animal professionals, I guess, to be able to, evaluate and make sure that all the needs of animals are being met. So it's not something we designed. It's a thing out there been for a while.
Oh, yeah, it's been around for a long time. It's really, as Trish said, it's really designed for more like livestock animals, farm animals and things like that, okay? That's what it was built around. And as Trish said, it doesn't translate over to dogs in domestic situations very well because it wasn't designed to. I mean, again, you can bend and twist and try and make it fit into things, but it doesn't do that. Also want to point out that Bonnie Beaver, for those that don't know it, back in 1999, she wrote the first, well, I better not say the first, but one of the first veterinary behaviourists manuals, and she's a professor of veterinary behaviour and very well published lady and well credentialed. And so, yeah, she's done a bit of a critique of the 5 freedoms, which is definitely worth reading, particularly if you're using the 5 freedoms as a model, okay? For those that don't know about it or don't use it or think about it, fair enough, because it probably doesn't matter. But if you are somebody who is promoting the 5 freedoms as your source material for the arguments around welfare and training protocols and procedures, then you should definitely review that Bonnie Beaver information without a doubt.
Wonderful. So you'll provide us the link and I'll put that on the members page as mentioned. So I think that sort of concludes part 1 of the Balanced LIMA protocols. Does anyone else want to add anything before we finish off for this one?
No, I'm all good.
Lovely.
No, I think we've covered most of the things we wanted to, so that's good.
And Jackie had to leave a little bit early, so she says goodbye. So thanks very much for joining us, everyone. We'll be back with another episode shortly, and it will be part 2 of this particular topic. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks, guys.